The only sound in the packed lecture hall was the rhythmic scratching of chalk against the board. Professor Victoria Grayson moved with practiced precision, her hands sweeping across the vast black surface as she etched out an intricate calculus equation. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that always accompanied her lessons, especially when she prepared to challenge her students. She was a veteran professor at Stanford, known for her sharp intellect, unrelenting standards, and most notably, her ability to weed out those who didn't belong. Over the years, she had built a reputation for producing top-tier mathematicians, students who had come from elite prep schools, students whose parents had donated generously to the university, students who were born and bred for academia, and yet, as she turned back to face the class, her sharp gaze instinctively flickered toward the back row, where a new face sat among the familiar ones. Marcus Wright. She hadn't expected him here. Not in her class. Not at this level. Professor Grayson knew every student who passed through her doors, their academic backgrounds, their potential, their worth. But Marcus Wright was an anomaly, a late transfer from Howard University. She had read his file, of course. His credentials were technically impressive, but he hadn't come from the same privileged pipeline as the others. He lacked the polish, the pedigree. He was an outsider. The students in the front row, her protégés, had noticed him too. Some watched with idle curiosity, others with faint amusement, as if waiting for the inevitable moment he would struggle to keep up. He wasn't taking notes, she observed. Instead, he sat with his notebook open, pen tapping idly against the page, watching her, not with nervousness, not with eagerness, just quiet, steady observation. That irritated her. She dusted off her hands and clasped them behind her back. "Since we have a new addition to the class," she announced, her voice cutting through the air, "perhaps Mr. Wright would like to introduce himself." A murmur passed through the room as heads turned toward him. Some expressions were polite, others barely masked their amusement. First-day introductions weren't uncommon, but everyone understood what this was. A test. Marcus looked up, unfazed. Marcus Wright, transferred from Howard. Nothing more. No extra details. No attempt to ingratiate himself. Professor Grayson arched an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a tight line. She was used to students scrambling to impress her, listing their accolades, eager for her approval. He, however, offered nothing but the bare minimum. She said coolly. "I hope you're prepared. This class isn't easy." "I am." His voice was steady, even. There was something about his tone, calm, almost indifferent, that unsettled her. She had dealt with students who were overconfident before, ones who thought they could coast on natural ability alone. They always fell. Best to test him now. She turned back to the board and gestured at the problem she had just written. It was complex, designed to challenge even her best students. "Since you're here," she said smoothly, "let's see where you stand. Can you tell me the first step to solving this?" A hushed ripple moved through the room. This wasn't normal. First-day challenges were rare, and usually reserved for students she had doubts about. Everyone understood the implication. Marcus, however, didn't even blink. He leaned forward, studied the equation for a brief moment, then spoke. "You'd start with a partial fraction decomposition," he said casually. "But given the structure, a Laplace transform would be more efficient." Silence. Even the students who had been smirking earlier suddenly looked up, eyes darting between Marcus and the professor. Professor Grayson's fingers curled slightly. That was correct. Not just correct, insightful. Most students would have fumbled through a basic decomposition, taking the long way around. He had skipped straight to an advanced method. Without hesitation, she wouldn't be thrown off that easily. "An unconventional approach," she said carefully, her voice measured. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll see if your methods hold up under pressure." She turned back to the board, but she could feel it. The shift in the room, the way students exchanged quick glances, the subtle way some leaned forward, suddenly more interested in the newcomer than they had been before. This wasn't over, and from the way Marcus sat back, calm and unbothered, he knew it too. The challenge had begun. Professor Victoria Grayson didn't like surprises, and Marcus Wright had already thrown off the rhythm of her class. His answer had been too quick, too precise. She had expected hesitation, a stumble, anything that confirmed her initial assumption that he didn't belong at this level. Instead, he had cut straight through the problem with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was doing. That didn't sit well with her. She had built this class to be elite, to separate the truly exceptional from those who merely thought they were. It wasn't just about intelligence. It was about rigor, discipline, and earning one's place. Marcus hadn't earned his yet. A transfer student from Howard, no connections, no prestigious prep school background. He would have to prove himself, and she would make sure of it. Grayson clasped her hands behind her back, surveying the room as she moved to the next problem. A longer equation, more intricate than the first. She could feel the class shifting. Students who had once been indifferent were now paying attention. They had sensed something, an undercurrent of tension, a game being played that only a few could fully grasp. She wasn't about to let him walk through this class with that unearned confidence. "All right," she said, her voice crisp, controlled. "Let's see if you've been paying attention." She turned to the class. "Who can tell me the significance of this transformation in real-world applications?" Hands shot up immediately, mostly from the front row, the students she had mentored personally, the ones whose futures in academia were all but guaranteed. She ignored them, her eyes locked on Marcus. "Mr. Wright." A few heads turned toward him, some with barely concealed amusement, others with genuine curiosity. Marcus didn't react right away. He let the moment stretch, then set his pen down with deliberate ease. "It's used in signal processing, engineering models, and differential equations," he said simply. "But in this case, you're using it to simplify an otherwise complex integral." Another silence, another perfect answer. Professor Grayson's jaw tightened. She nodded stiffly, turning away without acknowledgement. "Let's move on." But she knew. The students knew. A few exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. She could feel it. The control she prided herself on was slipping, just slightly. She wouldn't let that happen. For the next hour, as she moved through the lesson, she peppered the class with questions. And time and again, those questions landed on one person. "Mr. Wright, walk us through this proof." "Mr. Wright, is that the most efficient method?" "Mr. Wright, explain why this approach wouldn't work." By the third time, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Even those who had initially found it amusing started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some smirked, sensing a challenge designed to break him down. Others merely watched, waiting for the moment he cracked under the pressure. But Marcus didn't flinch. He answered each question, calmly, without hesitation, without frustration, without giving her the reaction she wanted. And that infuriated her more than anything. By the time class ended, she was no closer to proving her point than when she had started. She capped her marker and turned to the students. "We'll pick up from here next time," she said briskly. "Read chapters 4 and 5 before Monday." Chairs scraped against the floor as students packed their things. A few lingered, whispering. Marcus slid his notebook into his bag and stood. As he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Wright." He turned. She folded her arms. "You seem prepared for someone who transferred in late." Marcus met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I study." A pause. She didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, her tone cool, "let's hope you can keep up." And then she turned away, dismissing him as if the conversation had already ended. But Marcus wasn't the only one who had been watching. Someone else had noticed. And soon Victoria Grayson was going to regret underestimating him, proving himself. By the time the next lecture rolled around, the room was packed. Word had spread. Professor Victoria Grayson had singled out Marcus Wright, and he hadn't flinched. He had taken every question, every challenge, and answered them without hesitation. Now the students were curious. Would she try again? Would he slip up? Or was there something different about him? Marcus walked in as he always did, calm, focused, unbothered. He slid into his seat, flipping open his notebook, while the murmurs hummed around him. Some students watched him from the corner of their eyes, their curiosity barely hidden. Others smirked, waiting for the inevitable moment Grayson would go after him again. At the front of the room, Professor Grayson was already writing on the board. The expressions stretched across the surface were long, complex, intimidating, the kind of problem that made even her most dedicated students hesitate. She capped her marker, turned and scanned the room. "This problem," she said smoothly, "will require everything we've covered so far. It's advanced, time-consuming, even professionals struggle with it." A pause, then, with calculated precision, she turned to one person. "Mr. Wright." Silence fell over the room. Some students exchanged glances. Others sat up straighter, suddenly more interested. The smirks from the previous class had faded, replaced by something else: anticipation. Marcus set his pen down, his expression unreadable. But there was a shift in his posture, a quiet readiness that made a few students hold their breath. He knew what this was. She wasn't just calling on him. She was setting him up. A few students smirked, sensing the trap. Others looked uncomfortable. They all understood the game now. Grayson wanted him to fail. But Marcus stood, unfazed, and walked to the front. Professor Grayson stepped aside, arms crossed, watching. He studied the board for a few seconds. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the marker and started writing. At first, no one reacted. But then they noticed the way his hand moved. Fluid, precise, confident. He wasn't pausing to think. He wasn't second-guessing. He was solving it. Whispers started. "Wait, is he actually? Hold on, I thought this was supposed to be impossible." Line after line, he reduced, restructured, eliminated unnecessary steps. The entire room was locked onto him now. Even Professor Grayson's expression shifted. The sharp confidence she always carried, now replaced with something else. Minutes passed. Then, without any dramatic flourish, Marcus set the marker down, stepped back, and turned to face the class. The equation was solved. Clean, efficient, beautiful. A heavy silence filled the room. One student muttered under his breath, "No way." Another blinked at the board, still processing what had just happened. And Professor Grayson, for the first time, she looked caught. She stepped forward, scanning his work, searching for a mistake, an oversight, anything to pick apart. But there was nothing. It was flawless. Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just stood there waiting. Professor Grayson slowly turned to him. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes told the truth. She had underestimated him, badly, and worse, the entire class saw it. A shift in power. The silence in the lecture hall stretched, thick and undeniable. Marcus Wright had done the impossible. He had taken the trap Professor Victoria Grayson had set for him and turned it into his moment. The problem on the board, one she had deliberately chosen to be overwhelming, time-consuming, designed to break him, was now solved with brilliant efficiency. Every student in the room could see it. They weren't whispering anymore. They weren't smirking. They were watching, waiting. And so was Marcus. Professor Grayson's fingers curled slightly as she scanned his solution. She was searching for a flaw, something to latch onto, to reassert control. But there was nothing. He had done it perfectly. She cleared her throat. "Well," she said carefully, trying to mask the unease creeping into her tone, "that's certainly an unconventional approach. A weak attempt to reclaim ground." And then, before anyone could react, someone shifted in the back of the room. A voice, smooth, authoritative, cut through the air. "I wouldn't call it unconventional." Heads turned. Marcus glanced over and saw a man he didn't recognize. Mid-50s, sharp suit, a presence that commanded attention. The murmur started again. "Wait, is that Dr. Pierce? The MIT professor?" Professor Grayson stiffened. She hadn't expected him to speak. Dr. Jonathan Pierce was more than just an academic. He was one of the leading minds in applied calculus and advanced theoretical models. His name carried weight, and now he was looking at Marcus, not with surprise, not with skepticism, but with approval. Dr. Pierce took a few steps forward, his eyes moving between the board and Marcus. He studied the solution, really studied it, then pointed at one section, nodding slightly. "This step here," he said, tapping the equation with his knuckle, Most would take 3 or 4 extra steps to get there. But you bypassed the unnecessary transformations? Marcus shrugged. Seemed inefficient. A pause, then a low chuckle. Dr. Pierce smiled. It was, but I haven't seen many students recognize that, especially not in real time. More whispers. Professor Grayson's grip tightened around the marker in her hand. She was losing ground, and she knew it. Mr. Wright, she interjected, her voice tighter than before. This isn't a competition. We value all approaches in this classroom. Dr. Pierce turned to her, his gaze level. Of course, he said. Then a beat. But let's be honest, Victoria. He gestured at the board. That's one of the cleanest solutions I've seen from a student in years. The final blow. A subtle shift ran through the room. Students exchanged glances, some with shock, others with thinly veiled amusement. The unshakable authority that Professor Grayson had held for years, it was crumbling. And Marcus? He remained calm, still unbothered, still composed. Dr. Pierce turned to him fully now. Where'd you learn to think like this? Marcus met his gaze, unreadable. My dad, a slight pause. He's an engineer. He taught me when I was a kid, always told me to find the simplest path before I start solving. Dr. Pierce nodded, thoughtful. Smart man. Marcus just gave a small nod in return, but Professor Grayson wasn't done fighting. She straightened her posture, desperate to regain control of her classroom. Well, she said briskly, erasing the board, this has been an interesting exercise, but let's refocus. We have a lecture to continue. Weak. The students weren't paying attention to her anymore. They were paying attention to Marcus. And then casually, like it was nothing, Dr. Pierce said it. Have you ever considered applying to MIT? Silence. Marcus blinked. What? Dr. Pierce shrugged. You've got a way of thinking that's rare. We could use minds like yours. The murmurs exploded. Marcus stared at him, unsure how to respond. Professor Grayson stepped forward quickly. Dr. Pierce, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. He turned to her, unfazed. So is talent like this. A few students stifled gas. Marcus kept his face unreadable. But inside, something shifted. He had spent years proving himself, years dealing with people like Victoria Grayson, people who expected him to fail. But now someone saw him. Dr. Pierce handed him a card. Think about it, he said simply, and if you're interested, give me a call. Marcus took the card. It felt heavier than it should have. He nodded once. I will. Dr. Pierce smiled, then turned to leave. But before he did, he glanced back at Professor Grayson, and with the slightest hint of amusement, he said, Looks like you misjudged this one. And then he walked out. The class was never going to see her the same way again. And she knew it. The fallout professor, Victoria Grayson, stood frozen, her grip tightening around the marker in her hand. She could feel it, the shift in the room. For years, this lecture hall had been her domain. She had commanded it with precision, shaping young minds, determining who was worthy and who was not. Her word had been final. But now, in a matter of minutes, a student she had dismissed, one she had tried to break, had dismantled that image. Students were still staring, some at Marcus Wright, others at her. A few exchanged glances, quiet smirks forming at the corners of their lips. They had all witnessed it, her failure to shake him, her failure to prove he didn't belong, and worst of all, they had seen someone more powerful than her recognize him for what he was. Exceptional. The tension was suffocating. Professor Grayson forced herself to speak, regaining what little control she had left. All right, she said stiffly, her voice clipped. That's enough distractions for today. Back to the material. But no one was listening. The whispers continued. The energy in the room had changed, and she hated it. She pushed through the remainder of the lecture, her voice sharp, her pace quicker than usual. Equations covered the board, her back turned to the class more than it should have been. She refused to look at Marcus, but she could feel him there, unshaken, unbothered. By the time class ended, she dismissed them with a clipped, "See you next week." Students gathered their things. Some lingered to whisper to each other. Some sneaked glances at Marcus. But Marcus? He moved as he always did, calm, focused. He slid his notebook into his bag and stood. Just as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Wright." He turned. She stood behind her desk, her arms crossed tightly, her usual air of authority fractured. For the first time, there was something almost hesitant in her posture. She studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "You seem prepared for someone who transferred in late." Marcus met her gaze, unreadable. "I study." A pause. She didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, her tone cool, controlled, "let's hope you can keep up." And just like that, she dismissed him, turning away as if the conversation had already ended. But Marcus? He didn't move. He waited until the last student filtered out before speaking. "Professor?" She glanced up, her fingers tightening slightly against the desk. "Yes, Mr. Wright." He studied her for a moment, his expression calm. Too calm. Then in a tone that was neither arrogant nor accusatory, he said, "I know what you were trying to do." Her expression didn't change, but he saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, feigning ignorance. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You wanted me to fail." A muscle in her jaw tensed. "That's ridiculous." Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. It's not." He took a step closer, his voice steady, deliberate. "You kept pushing, kept waiting for me to slip up." He let the words settle. Then with quiet finality, he said, "But I didn't." Professor Grayson's fingers curled against the desk. "You're imagining things, Mr. Wright." His lips pressed together, but his eyes held hers, unwavering. "Am I?" She didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. He let the silence stretch before speaking again. "I've dealt with this before, Professor. People expecting me to be less than I am, acting surprised when I'm not." He slid his bag over his shoulder. "You know what the difference is this time?" She didn't respond. So he leaned in slightly, his voice lower. Not angry, not gloating, just undeniable. This time, people saw it. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, still gripping her marker like it was the last thing tethering her to control. For the first time in years, she wasn't the most respected mind in the room, and she hated that more than anything. The weight of recognition. That night, Professor Grayson sat in her office, fingers hovering over her keyboard. She wanted to type something, an email, an excuse, a way to reframe the situation. But there was nothing to say, no way to spin it. She had been wrong. And worse, she had been predictable. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his dorm room, staring at Dr. Pierce's card, flipping it between his fingers, processing everything that had happened. He had walked into that classroom expecting to be challenged. He had dealt with people like Grayson before, but this time had been different. This time, he hadn't just proved himself, he had been seen. He pulled out his phone, dialed, a voice picked up almost immediately. "Dr. Pierce speaking." Marcus hesitated for only a second. Then, with the same quiet confidence he had carried through the entire ordeal, he said, "I'd like to talk about MIT." A small chuckle on the other end. "I was hoping you'd say that." As Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thought settled in his mind, one that had taken years to truly believe. His talent spoke for itself, and no one, not even people like Victoria Grayson, could take that away. Because no matter how much someone tries to diminish you, the truth has a way of coming to light. And when it does, the only thing left to do is shine. The power of resilience and recognition. At its core, Marcus Wright's story is a testament to the power of resilience, self-belief, and the undeniable nature of talent. Throughout life, many people will face situations where they're underestimated, challenged unfairly, or judged based on preconceived notions rather than their true abilities. Professor Grayson represents a broader reality, those who set barriers not based on merit, but on bias. However, what makes Marcus's journey inspiring is that he never let those biases define him. He did not seek validation through defiance or arrogance. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. This lesson is vital in everyday life. No matter where you come from or what challenges you face, your skills, Discipline and perseverance will always be your strongest assets. People may doubt you. They may try to place limits on what you can achieve. But as Marcus showed, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Hard work, preparation, and confidence in your own abilities will always set you apart. Another powerful takeaway is the importance of being seen by the right people. Dr. Pierce's recognition of Marcus's talent was a game changer, proving that sometimes all it takes is one person in the right position to open a door that was never meant to be closed. This highlights the importance of seeking mentors, building strong networks, and staying prepared for opportunities, because when the moment comes, you must be ready to step up. Most importantly, Marcus's story reminds us that true success is not just proving others wrong, it's proving yourself right. His victory wasn't in humiliating Professor Grayson, but in knowing that his worth was never in question, only waiting to be acknowledged. So whether in the workplace, in school, or in life, never let someone else's doubt dictate your potential. Keep pushing, keep proving yourself, and when the time comes, don't just rise to the challenge, own it.